In this Pinpoint series, we have talked about nationalism from various perspectives, introduced the problem of scalability of human relationships, made a distinction between territorial and civilizational nationalism, briefly examined the world without borders that people like George Soros advocate for, and then compared that proposition with what Sri Aurobindo called the ideal of human unity. In between, we had a couple of episodes on narratives and game theory. But I realized that much of it had become quite dense and ran the risk of becoming abstract, despite my best efforts to keep the discourse as tangible as possible. Therefore, I thought it would be a good idea to start from the basics again and try to integrate all the diverse themes that we have touched upon so far, while answering perhaps the most pertinent question: does nationalism have a future? But let us turn to the past first and figure out the foundational constituents of a nation. In other words, what makes a nation and what distinguishes it from other nations? To cut all the academic clutter that has accumulated around the concept, thanks to the failure of the Westphalian model of nation states that gave us imperialism, the world wars, Cold War, and so on, we can say that things that shape a nation most profoundly are: one, its geography; second, its culture; third, history; and fourth, the collective aspirations of its people. Geography is, of course, the most fundamental factor that shapes a nation. In what constitutes perhaps 95% of our written history, geography pretty much ruled the destiny of nations. Geographical factors dictated the nature of military strategy, the extent of cultural intermixing, and the degree of isolation of a region. The Pacific and the Atlantic Oceans kept the Native American people safe and isolated from the rest of the world for a very long time. But once technology made it possible for Europeans to cross the ocean, the same strength turned into a bane, as these indigenous communities were no match to the cunning as well as the superior weaponry of the invaders, not to mention their low immunity to European diseases. Similarly, Britain was an unimportant island divided among 30 primitive tribes, always at each other's throats, before the Roman Empire unified them as subjects. The Britons were quite primitive compared to the continental Europeans because the island was physically isolated from the rest of the continent. Geography has a profound influence on the second factor, that is culture. Sub-Saharan Africa, for example, remained culturally underdeveloped due to the insurmountable physical barriers to intracontinental travel and a dearth of navigable rivers, which prevented African communities from intermixing freely and developing a sophisticated culture and technology of their own. They had a desert to the north and major oceans to the east, south, and west. It is interesting that though Africa is the second largest continent in the world, it has the shortest coastline of all continents. To make matters worse, the coastline is not indented, which makes it beautiful, all right, but also ill-suited for harboring ships, reflected in Africa's minimal participation in pre-modern maritime trade. Africa's isolation and consequent lack of a pervasive culture made its people vulnerable to exploitative foreigners who literally enslaved them for centuries. This brings us to the third factor I mentioned, that is history. And as we can see, the history of the African slave trade has roots in the continent's geography and the consequent lack of a pervasive pre-modern culture. Even the history of slavery has very interesting patterns to observe in terms of demand and supply. Africa mostly supplied female slaves to the Ottoman and other Islamic empires for filling their harems, leaving the savannah with an excess of men and children. Later on, when Europeans got into the large-scale slave trade, men for plantation work in the Americas were in high demand, and men became scarce in West Africa. In both cases, the imbalance of sexes had cultural consequences, most notably in the growth of polygamy in the society. So the point that I am making here is that the collective identity of a people, which gives them a sense of nationhood, is determined by a relentless interplay between geography, culture, and history. Having acquired a collective consciousness, a nation stares into the abyss called the future and makes moral, political, and cultural choices based on the collective aspiration of its people. That collective aspiration is called civilization. In the Indian context, the blessed geography of the Indian subcontinent enabled trade and commerce to thrive, allowed profound ideas to travel across the land, and allowed for a paradoxical mix of cultural diversity delicately poised on the bedrock of dharmic unity. In my view, regaining this magical paradox is the key to India's future. But where did we lose that key? In the last 800 years, India's history was dominated by the violent attack on our indigenous way of life by alien invaders. Just like how the Native Americans were under the assault of white Europeans in the 15th and 16th centuries. Added to that, the Industrial Revolution changed the whole world dramatically and gave rise to capitalism and communism primarily. But alas, we survived. But today, when we look into the future, are we empowered enough to actualize our collective aspirations and civilizational goals? Can we even verbalize these goals? Why not is a question that must bother all of us. Today, we live in a globalized world where it is safe to say that no nation exists in isolation. The liberal modernist view is characterized by a disdain for national identities as the engine of global capitalism, sees the world as a mosaic of resources and markets. In this deeply materialistic view, national borders are an avoidable inconvenience. How great would it be, argues the die-hard capitalist, if the whole world had one set of laws and tax structures to make it easy for the corporations to do business anywhere they please and generate wealth for all. So what role does nationalism play in such a world? From the point of view of the transnational corporations, the only use for nationalism is that it strengthens the nation state, the government, whose primary role as far as these MNCs are concerned is to monopolize violence and provide a safe and secure environment for the corporations to make money. Anything more than that starts becoming an inconvenience, a headache. But from the point of view of ordinary people anywhere in the world with some degree of cultural rooting, nationalism is an expression of their identity and again their collective aspirations. This national identity promotes cohesiveness in society and makes the nation stable. This was recognized by US President Woodrow Wilson when he coined the phrase right of self-determination in 1916. The phrase since has been very useful to every single genuine seeker of political freedom, as well as terrorists spreading mayhem in the name of freedom, like in Kashmir. It is interesting that while this coinage was termed as a decisive turning point in the history of the modern world by the press, Wilson's own Secretary of State, Robert Lansing, was rather distressed by it. He wrote in his diary that the phrase would come back to haunt the world, as it did a few years down the line when powerful politicians worked on redrawing the national boundaries of Europe based on their arbitrary and half-baked ideas of minority oppression and whatnot, leading to the dismemberment of the Habsburg Empire and the creation of small self-determined states that were duly annexed by Nazi Germany in the following decade. If the point is not obvious already, let me spell it out clearly. The right of self-determination presents a peculiar problem. At what threshold of population or area does it become a viable option to invoke self-determination to declare your people to be an independent nation? This is particularly relevant to Bharat, faced with numerous secessionist movements often funded by enemy nations or global religious organizations, or often both together. The lesson to be drawn from the havoc caused by the idea of self-determination in Europe of the 20s and 30s is that along with the cohesiveness of a people, there is another factor that must be taken into account. That is, how capable is the nation of defending itself? Thus, it is in the blend of cohesiveness of a people and the ability of that cohesive unit to defend itself that national consciousness emerges. If the people of a region are incapable of defending themselves, they will either be annexed by an enemy state or cultivated as a vassal state of some kind by the same enemy. For instance, if Kashmir were to gain independence, it would either formally join Pakistan or be used by Pakistan to inflict more damage on India. That much is clear. So where does civilizational nationalism figure in this scheme? Sam Huntington defines civilization as the highest cultural grouping of people and the broadest level of cultural identity people have, short of that which distinguishes human beings from other species. Accordingly, a civilization may consist of multiple nation states, as is the case with Islamic and Western civilizations. However, for Hindus, our civilization is synonymous with the country that is India. And there is no other country in the world, with the exception of Nepal, that can be considered to be part of the Hindu civilization. So the dismemberment of India would thus mean the annihilation of the Indic civilization, because the smaller countries would never be able to defend their freedom and maintain their culture in the face of global hostile forces, both religious and geopolitical. Let us go even further. Why should that even matter? Because this question can only come from a universalist premise, that is, a worldview that does not even recognize the existence of other worldviews, much less their desirability. So it must be answered in a universalist context. The most overpowering force in the modern world is the beast of technology. Remember, we spoke about geography being the foundation of a nation and how the physical environment shapes culture and history. What technology has done is that it has snatched all power from geography by isolating human beings from their natural environment. While this in itself is a topic for maybe another day, but what I'm getting at here is that modern technology, by homogenizing our physical environment and turning it artificial, is also homogenizing our culture. Given that technology itself is culturally neutral, it becomes an agent of cultural forces that dominate it. It is not surprising that modernization and technological progress inevitably lead to westernization. It is not because of the inherent nature of technology as such, but that most of its levers are in the hands of the so-called West. And the direction in which technology is headed is determined by the cultural choices of Western civilization, which are further informed by their sense of morality. These choices have been ecologically disastrous. So let's go back to the original question. Does nationalism have a future? Looks like the answer depends on the kind of nationalism we have in mind. Nations built on the hollow foundations of Enlightenment values are collapsing under the weight of demographic imbalance and ecological threats. At the same time, we are headed towards a future that will require the planet to take a united stand on critical issues of ecological sustainability and the limits of economic growth. Different nations speak in different voices, but humanity will need to speak as one. Whose voice is it going to be? That is the real clash of civilizations. And if Bharat does not rise to the occasion, we will not only fail our ancestors, but the planet itself. Let me state it bluntly. Nationalism does have a future. It is called Hindu civilizational nationalism, which derives its ethos from nature and allows for that paradoxical mix of cultural diversity delicately poised on the bedrock of dharmic unity. The time for imperialist arrogance and barbaric violence is well over. As the liberal, progressive, woke social justice warrior would say, hello, it is the 21st century.